Welcome to our new history show called Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Lori Roberts, and today we've got an interesting show lined up for you. We've got a guest that I'm going to be speaking with about history, and the topic of our show this time is William Henry Harrison. And this show is going to start at the very beginning, when Indiana wasn't even Indiana. We're going to go way back, and we're going to look at this area when it was still under French territory, and we're going to kind of move from there. We're going to find out, well, how did we get to be Indiana? And so the first couple of shows, we're going to look at Indiana as a territory. And then we're going to move and we're going to look at, well, who was here in that territory? And there were a lot of Native Americans, there were Indians that were here. So one of the shows that we're going to do is going to be focusing on Indians, which is apropos to what is going on this month. For those of you that may not know, this is Native American History Month. And during Native American History Month, for the whole month, we're going to be talking about Native Americans and what they had to do with Indiana. So before we get started, I've got a quote, and because it's Native American History Month, it has something to do with Native Americans. When the Native Americans were here, the French actually were the first Europeans to come into this area. And the Indians and the French had an alliance because of the fur trade. But the English were also here. And so at one point, an American Indian is talking to an English trader. And over time, the identity of these two people have been lost, but you'll get the gist. The Indian says, "You and the French are like the two edges of a pair of shears, and we are the cloth which is to be cut to pieces between them." So that's kind of where we're going to get started today with that Native American History Month, and kind of gives you an idea. There were Native Americans all in this territory, and so today we have a guest that is a friend of mine. He's also my boss, and so I would like to introduce Mr. Lucas Calhoun, who is one of the new administrators here in Lawrence County. He is at Shawswick Middle School. Welcome. Thanks for being my first guest.
I'm honored to be a part of this show. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Do you want to kind of give us a little background of how you came to be at the best school in Lawrence County?
I agree. Yes, so I am now the principal at Shawswick Middle School. Prior to that, I was an e-coach in the district, so I've been around this area. But my wife and two kids live in this area, and prior to that, I was a history teacher for a number of years, and I also studied in graduate school for history, which I loved, but I needed to be around people. So I left after 1 year at the University of Maine and came here and began teaching. And ever since I was a little guy, I would rent videos from the library in Kansas where I grew up and on historical topics. And that's why I watch documentaries with regularity and read. And history is just what I choose to focus on, because it's also a great opportunity to really know where we come from and how to make wise decisions going forward.
So have you always lived around here?
In this geographic area, we moved to from Kansas when I was 12, and we moved to Bloomfield. Okay. So I've lived in Bloomfield and Odin, Indiana, and now here in Bedford, and we love living in Bedford.
Well, we're glad to have you, and I'm especially excited to have a principal that's excited about history, because we can kind of have our geek talks during the day, and so it was kind of a no-brainer that you would be here first.
Yeah.
So
well, that was the rejected name of the show. The original, was two geeks talking, but it didn't sell well. We had to move to Historically Speaking, which is better.
Is equally as interesting. So thank you. And for a minute, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the background, and I know everybody's rolling their eyes because it's like, oh no, we're going to have to listen to history, but it's kind of a good idea to find out kind of the background so you understand how we got to where we are. Like I said at the very beginning, the French were here mainly because of the fur trade. And you had the fur traders, you had the Native Americans who were here together, And then later we had some settlers that came in and also the missionaries. So there were different people here for different reasons, but for the most part, the Native Americans kind of had an alliance with the French. And by 1722, they were building forts in this area. The Miami Indians were nearby at the location where the Maumee and the Wabash rivers meet. So we're talking up around Fort Wayne, Indiana. So we're still a little north of where we are today. But these people were coming out to these forts and they were wanting to protect the fur trade. It was a pretty big business to have the fur. And we've got a coonskin cap over here. Not everybody wore coonskin caps, but everybody did wear something on their head. So if you were out here in the frontier, you wouldn't have brought your nice, hat that you had. You would have made it out of whatever you could find. And of course, there were a lot of pelts and furs, so that's what that coonskin cap represents. But probably the closest fort to us was Vincennes, and tomorrow, the next show is going to focus on Vincennes, and so we'll kind of skip past Vincennes, but there was a fort there as well, nearby.
And some of our viewers may be wondering, well, why would the Native Americans align with the French when, what they thought might be bad happening? Well, the Native Americans didn't know that there was going to be so many non-Native American people coming in later on. So if you make a deal with people that there's not very many of them at the time, it seems okay.
Right.
And it was good, a smaller crew, smaller
good
contingent.
Business.
Yeah, good business.
Well, and good that you pointed that out, because later on, when more people are starting to come into the area, the French find out really quick who's probably going to be their best neighbors.
Yeah.
The person who's going to help them economically, or the person who's going to want to kick them off their land.
Absolutely.
So that was a good point as well. So wouldn't be long before these English settlers start coming in. And of course, they're going to send somebody by the name of George Washington to come in and tell these nasty French people to get off the land that they want so badly. But that didn't work out so well for Washington, and that's a show for another day.
Yeah.
But obviously, he has to hang his head and go back and tell his commander that he had to surrender for necessity. And that's when we get to the French and Indian War. And so the French and Indian Wars fought over a period of time from 1754 through 1763. And so people who lived in this area, they were in that area, and they were fighting right along, with the Indians. And as settlers, we would have fought with the British. If we were a settler, even, on the East Coast, there was mostly the British. So the French and Indian War ends, and Britain wins the war. Into the winter goes the spoils. And all of these French fur trappers and traders, the Algonquin Indians who had sided with them, the Huron, they are finding out that they backed the wrong horse. And so they lose all of their holdings from the Mississippi River all the way to the Appalachian Mountains.
And up north and south too, right?
And north and south. How far north?
Into upper parts of today's Canada.
I knew that they went, but I didn't know how far
Yeah,
that they lost.
up into Lake Ontario. It was pretty far.
Oh, it's a pretty...
And more towards the St. Lawrence.
St. Lawrence River. Okay, so we're talking a big chunk of land. And so after the war, to end a war, and all my students know, I always say, now if we're going to end a war, what do we have to have? And the word is?
A treaty.
A treaty.
Yes.
So the Treaty of Paris was signed, and then we start to divvy up to the winter goes the spoils.
Yeah.
And so the American colonists, as soon as that war was over, they started coming right over those Appalachian Mountains. And there's a really good map that I use in my classroom, and it shows what this country looked like in 1763 and then again in 1783, and it shows, the comparison of the two. And obviously our country was about half the size at the end of 1783 than it is today.
Absolutely.
So was there something that you particularly wanted to bring out when we were talking earlier about after the French and Indian War?
Yeah, just the idea that, well, if you look at the map of Canada and the United States and even down into present-day Mexico, it was almost like puzzle pieces too, that, that we'd add something here, move something there, and we don't do things like that anymore with wars and typically. So the idea that, something would be gone and then somebody else's and now it's somebody else's is interesting, but also that Indiana was a pretty unique place because we were near the westernmost border of the United States for a good long time. And even at the time of the Second Treaty of Paris, the United States was pretty small.
Yeah.
Compared to France and they had global holdings.
Right.
And just after the Revolutionary War, we just had a small piece.
And when we think about this war, I mean, as Americans, we're used to hearing about the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War. They were fought here, but we have to understand the French and the British were also fighting in another war.
Yeah.
And so the 7 Years' War was going on when the French and Indian War was going on. So they were kind of pulling at both ends because they had to supply things here and they also had to take care of their soldiers elsewhere. And poor King George, you have to almost feel sorry for the poor guy, bless his heart, because the British soldiers who were left after the French and Indian War were stuck trying to hold down the fort, so to speak.
Yeah.
And everybody got something out of the French and Indian War except the Indians. And so the Indians decide, well, if that's what's going to happen, then we're going to have some retaliation. So Pontiac has Pontiac's rebellion and starts hitting those settlements. And so after that, the king thinks, well, maybe we ought to give him something.
Yeah.
And so that proclamation line is drawn, and all these poor settlers who are here are told, you have to leave.
Yeah.
You have to, pack up and go for the Indians to have the land.
And culturally, it's interesting at this time, too, because when the Indians and the French were making treaties, they almost were in a place where, in the early, mid-1700s, where they could live amongst each other. There wasn't, you must be a certain way. It was almost a mutual respect, and they would adopt each other's cultural things in various ways. But then you start to see this shift in the late 1700s, and then obviously to the sadder part in the mid-1800s, which I'm sure the show will delve into in future episodes, where there's a cultural appropriation. It's your culture, or Native American person, is not fitting the mold of what it means to be United States, so you need to be completely different. Whereas before it was more of a respect side of, you live this way, we live this way, we're going to do business, good neighbors,
Right.
good fences, that type of thing. And then you definitely see a shift later on.
Right. And, the fur traders had Indian wives, and you didn't see as much with the English settlers, but a lot of the French did. So there was more of a respect, like
Yeah.
you said, a mutual respect. And so it wouldn't take long before this proclamation line was just another red line, and
Yeah.
people crossed it. And eventually we went back to war. And this time we're colonists who want our freedom, we want our respect, and we want representation, and we
Yes.
weren't getting that. So it leads to, and you remember your history, the Revolutionary War.
Absolutely.
And Indiana even played a role in the Revolutionary War. A lot of people probably don't know about
Tell
George
us more.
Rogers Clark.
Yes.
Clark County, Clarksville, named after him. And he was given a detachment of troops, and he was supposed to take those troops and go out to capture Fort Sackville. And it was pretty much a done deal. Do you remember the trickery he used? Do you remember
Oh,
that?
I'm going back in my brain. You're going to have to tell me. No, I don't remember.
There was something about he wanted to make his troops look bigger.
Is it something with the trees and like things going off of it, almost like scarecrows, but not,
Yes.
but dressing them?
He used the flags and their guns, and he spread them out
Yeah.
throughout the woods, and he made them look like there was more than what there
Yeah.
was, and it worked.
Yeah.
And so, Fort Sackville.
Which works because of the way that as battles at times were in formation line, rows and rows and rows. So he definitely set up an intimidating
Sure.
layout.
And he kind of learned that from Washington. Washington was all the time doing those things. And so we'll learn more about him in another show doing those kind of things. But the war drags on from, what, 1775 to 1781,
Yep.
the Battle of Yorktown. Poor Cornwallis gets
know.
corralled there at Yorktown. And so now the war's over, but in order to end the war, we have to have another
Treaty.
And
And
so where is this treaty?
this one happens to be in one of the most romantic cities in the world, Paris, where you create peace with your treaty.
Yes.
And in this time period, the war has ended, and the British have to own up to the fact that they got beat by the upstarts, because, and it's interesting too, jumping back to the other time periods, there's long windows of time where things are the way they are.
Right.
In the nature of this, it was fairly quick.
Yeah.
1770, as far as, like early grumblings in the Tea Party, etc. And then the Declaration of Independence, and now we're in 1782 in this treaty, and, we got here Lord Shelburne, and, there was two couple sides of the fences from when people were in Paris. It was, okay, should we not own the fact that we got beat, or should we work on being good business people, because they still looked at the Americas as a cash cow.
Right.
Potential.
Right.
So they looked at, what are we going to do? And as the Treaty of Paris was set up, obviously favorable to the United States because the United States won.
Yes.
Great Britain took major concessions, and you start to see a little bit of a crack here in the British, dominance of the world, partially because the vast size of the United States landscape and what it potentially could be. I mean.
Right.
We find out a little bit more later on, and again in a few years away from this with the Louisiana Purchase, but that land keeps going. So you have a good home court advantage. But this treaty, signed by Franklin Adams and John Jay at the Hotel de York, was finalized in 1783 and brought back to the Continental Congress, the early formation of our government, in early 1784. And one of the things I find interesting, and I always try to reflect to my students when I was teaching this stuff, is this was not like you pick up a phone and you call, or you even send a teletype or a fax or an email. I mean, this was not live streaming. This
Right.
was, these three individuals and their attaché of people, they were trusted to make some pretty heavy-duty decisions and represent this brand new country in a way that is going to also set us up for the future. So there wasn't any live tweeting or anything, and I'm not saying that in a way to put those current things down. It's just the sense of you really had to, it's kind of like when I get a list from my wife and I'm shopping and she doesn't fully specify the item type, just a rough idea, so I have to take that gamble. I'm like, okay, she's gonna take that one. So these guys made some big things, but Great Britain finally gave formal recognition to its colonies as a new independent nation. And again, there's two things that I think are important here. One is that they were going to have to admit it anyways.
Right.
It was just a reality. But in a British society where class was such a big deal, this was a emotional thing to make them have to say that we recognize you.
Sure, they were
And
calling
that-
us doodles.
Exactly.
Yankee doodles.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
political cartoons of the day, and other ways they would put down the colonist as not less than
Right.
lower in the system. So the fact that they had to formally recognize and admit was a big deal. So that was I would say that's a very big win for the United States. That's not really talked about because it's just obvious, but it really was like one of those things where they would never be the same.
Right.
The country of Great Britain. But then the Treaty of Paris, of course, formally ended the war. It didn't stop tensions,
No.
and that wasn't going to stop, and that kind of kept going for a number of years. And the British did, refuse to relinquish parts of its forts and the territories because, again, as you did showed wonderful maps, it's vast country. And some of it was defined, and some of it was not, where they were just territories, so they didn't have to give those up because they said that we had those. And then, of course, you have people that sided with the British early, but then tried to be with the Americans, and then they were called out based on were they like they're being two-faced to a degree. 1795, John Jay returns to Europe, and he's trying to solve these issues. And it's interesting because before, when we would send, we being the upstart, Americans, sending things to the king to say, we just want to be recognized for this. We'll pay a tax.
Right.
Just can you not make it so intense? and he wouldn't even, and I'm blanking on the name at the time of what they asked for, the colonists did, but it was, some sort of recognition thing, and he wouldn't even, like, look at it.
Oh, it was the Olive Branch petition.
There we go.
They sent that.
And he didn't even take a look. So that was, and so the
Yeah.
fact that John Jay is back, and I'm, in a way as an American, I'm proud that that was the take that the approach that we took, because we didn't have to go back and say, we'll work with you. We could have been like, we won, you didn't.
Sorry about you.
Sorry about you, exactly.
Right. And there were things that once they did have to recognize us, I mean, they had to kind of give some things up,
Yeah.
which it opened up this huge, like you said, vast amount of land that was for the taking. If you were ambitious enough and you wanted to cross over the Appalachian Mountains and you wanted to brave the Indians and Native Americans, it was there.
Yep.
Now, this brings us into the Northwest Territory, and we're getting closer. Indiana's still territory, but it's not really had a name. And so probably one of the best or most important things about independence and the Treaty of Paris was British gave up pretty generous boundaries for us. And as a part of the agreement, they ceded over this area of land that was known as the Northwest. And so we're talking about where Ohio is today.
Yes.
So as soon as you crossed over the Allegheny Mountains and you came from Pennsylvania, you were in what is now Ohio and Indiana and Michigan and Wisconsin, a little bit of Minnesota, and then and Illinois later, but that all became the Northwest Territory. So now they've got all this land.
Yes.
So what are they going to do with it? Because somebody has to be out there to watch it.
Yes, and it's diverse land. You've got farming options, you've got forestry, you've got waterways. So there's a lot of different things. You made a great point for the taking.
Sure.
There's a lot, dollar signs or whatever how they phrase the currency then.
Sure. Well, and everybody wanted to make a buck. You had land
Yes.
speculators, and you had people who were wanting to sell you this sight unseen because you didn't know what you were going to get, like with Forrest Gump.
Oh,
You never know what
yes,
you're going to
exactly.
get. Yeah. So, I mean, that was another thing. They didn't know exactly what they were going to get until they got there. But it did open up this vast amount of land. And so the first, I think, territorial governor was St. Clair, Arthur St. Clair. He was out during the very first. The ordinance encouraged American settlement, but you had to be careful because you didn't want to alienate the natives that were living there. The Americans came to build their homes. They didn't really care about keeping peace as long as it didn't involve them getting scalped or them having to, have a confrontation. But they came to make the land their own. And sadly, the natives, the Indians, saw that homeland being slowly taken away. And settlers constantly were under attack, and that's going to be a topic of a show down the road.
Yes.
The massacres that happened here in this area, the massacre at Fall Creek comes to mind.
Yes.
But did you?
I was going to just say one of the parts about how people were building and Americans were, advancing, is that you learn this, and it's an ingrained American thing as far as being strong and pulling up, your socks and your bootstraps. But also you see people's, their cockiness to they wouldn't adapt. So we'd see people building in the Northwest Territory houses that were primarily like row houses or in the East Coast, and that was not going to work here. Some of our areas you could not have a two-story thing. You needed to be lower to the ground or based on where they were doing it, and the adaptability if they didn't have it. And then if they were attacked by, natives, that was a double whammy.
Sure. And that was a lot of the reason why settlers had to be pretty crusty when they came out here. They had to adapt really quickly. You couldn't really have somebody who didn't care to work or, wanted to kind of stay back and watch. I mean, you had to take charge. There were some natives here, and we'll learn more about them. Little Turtle, who, he tried at first to come in and they had a confederacy that they had together of Indians. Little Turtle saw after a while that, this isn't going to work. It's futile. And so he actually called for peace. He was actually able to meet Washington. He gave up his fighting and went back.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about some other battles, the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and that's where we kind of bring in, we'll talk about Tecumseh, who is going to be a topic of another show
Absolutely.
soon. And by 1795, the Native Americans who are living in the West, Ohio, in western Ohio, send reps to Fort Greenville where they meet with a council of Native Americans. And they end up agreeing to cede most of the land, which will become Ohio and northern eastern Indiana. And here's the thing we got to think about too. Every time we offered to buy the land, and they agreed after some speaking to them, it was always interesting that they were always promised land in the West.
Yeah.
And they were in the West, but they were
Exactly.
promised a different West.
Yes.
And most of the time, they didn't see the money either. So, it's no wonder why they didn't agree to everything we were handing them, because
Absolutely. And it was in a set of terms that weren't common to the daily Native American lifestyle.
Exactly.
With, well, you'll get this every third year, or you'll get this at a, this particular rate. Or terms where if the land yields this, you will get this. And that they didn't roll that way. They did, a more of a flowing lifestyle.
Well, about the time of the Revolution and after the Revolution, people started to think less about their, who had the plantations in the East. It was who had the land in the West.
yes.
And that was going to become the next topic for the country to be worried about. And that kind of brings us up to 1800. This is when Indiana Territory actually breaks away from the Northwest Territory. And here we have William Henry Harrison, who is coming into the picture. And William Henry Harrison is a young military officer. He started out wanted to go to medical school. He was going to be a
Interesting, yes.
doctor.
Yeah.
And his father passed away, who was actually one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence.
Great lineage.
Wow,
Yes.
exactly. And so William Henry Harrison's father passes away, and they tell him, you're going to have to drop out of school.
Yeah.
But you can go in the military, which he does.
Yeah.
And so at age 27, he's elected our territorial delegate to the Northwest Territory to Congress, because Congress needed to have a representative out here.
Absolutely.
So, you think about 27.
Yes. And to have a life plan that he wanted to do something else.
Right.
And then now, honoring his family. And he knew his family's history. But also, college at that time, for a long time, even into the 1800s, was a privileged thing to get to do. So the fact that he was pulled out of college made it, and he would have been privileged to do so, to stay in school. The fact that they pulled him out was a big deal too, to honor his family's line and be that representative. And he stepped up to it.
He stepped up, and probably too, going, as we know he did, into the frontier, having that medical knowledge.
Absolutely.
Your soldiers are going to have broken bones. They're going to
Yes.
have cuts. Helps to have somebody, with a little
Yes.
bit of a cool head if they're
Yeah.
going to have to take care of you. One of the interesting things I didn't realize was in 1800, he was appointed the governor of Indiana Territory. And it's not like the governors are today. It was for 12 years.
Yeah.
He was going to be there for 12 years. And he had a couple other jobs. You're not only going to be the governor of this territory, but you're going to make sure that the Indians are dealt with fairly.
Yes.
And that was the wording, justice for the Indians. And this seems like it's so weird. And you're going to acquire the Indians' land.
Yeah. You're going to be nice to them, but also take from them.
Yeah, that seemed to be kind of a contradiction of words. But while he was governor, he also had to come to this territory, which is where we are talking about today, which is where he went to Vincennes. And so if you can imagine, the trip that he brought his wife,
Yes.
they had 10 children. Now, they didn't have all 10 in 1800. But they had a few. The house was being built. what were some of the things, we were kind of hitting back
Yeah.
and forth. What did you find out about the house?
Well, again, it's this interesting idea that he was to be peaceful with and make peace, but also that fortified house needed to be fortified
Right.
for attacks, but also be regal enough for his position. And it was one of the first brick homes in that entire area, which
Yeah.
is extremely interesting considering how long it's lasted.
And the house was, he called it Grouseland because of the birds.
The amount of birds in the area.
Yeah, lots
Yes.
of grouse that were around. And of course, his wife would have been used to having a fine home.
Yes,
She was
and
from
staff.
Anna Sims. I was trying to think. Her family, I can't think what her father didn't think she was worthy, or he was worthy of her.
Yes.
So, here she comes out in the middle of nowhere with him. I can't even imagine coming down the Ohio River and then having to get out.
Yes.
And then what this place would have looked like. But one of the things, too, they didn't even get to live in the house at first. They
No.
had to live with someone else.
Yes. And that was a shock to her. And what's interesting, too, about their marriage is that we know his line, and to think that he was a direct, like literally 1 degree to his father of the, the Declaration of Independence, that's so magnificent. And that he wasn't worthy is just sort of
Yeah.
like, well, what was the father's, and of course, I have a daughter, too, and I have high expectations, but,
Right.
he was kind of behind the 8 ball to a degree.
Well, yeah, as mothers and fathers, we kind of have the idea of who we want our
Yeah.
daughters to be with. Of course, once he got out here, he had to deal with the natives. That was part of his
Yes.
job. And so Little Turtle Tecumseh, who we're going to talk about in the next show, he actually had a lot of reason to come to Vincennes, and he would be dealing with the Indians quite often. So this house had to be a fortress, but it also
Yes.
had to be a nice home.
And the house had to
well.
be both, as you're saying. And what's interesting, too, is that sometimes the tensions would be lower based on how the Americans were living and building. So if it was more of a less permanent structure, then sometimes the Indians would be like, okay, they're probably not going to be around that long, or they're here for a season or whatever. But when you see the impressiveness of Grouseland,
Right.
the Indians were like, oh, wow, this is definitely a more permanent structure, which is why they had to fortify it, but it also led to tensions and he was supposed to be dealing positively
Right.
with the people in the area.
Excuse me, and he was gone a lot, so Anna, his wife, had to
Yes.
stay home with all these children. 4, I believe, were born in that house.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine the deal that she
Yes.
had with trying to keep, the house going and the children, and then worry about Indian attacks. So
Yes.
it was a pretty scary time for her as well. But Harrison would have Native Americans coming to the house, and he would be talking to them. The prophet was one of those. Harrison would later be sent up to Prophet's Town, and he would be, the Battle of Tippecanoe happened. So a lot of history we're going to get into in the next couple of shows with him. But as luck would have it, his career didn't end
Oh.
with being a governor.
No.
So it wasn't long before the War of 1812 breaks out.
Yes. We got a number of big things in a 10-year period, of course. The United States nearly doubles in size. So there's so much potential. His name's the war happens, and we'll talk about that as well. But his stock rises.
Sure.
And it's interesting, too, you mentioned a great point about how many different people of the native side visited Grouseland. I imagine, and again, we're just able to speculate, of course, but he knew what his father represented and what the American spirit of, we're not going to be treated this way. We are declaring our independence. And how you didn't do that then, to a big country like Great Britain. So he probably struggled to a degree with his internal feelings based on who he was talking to, because he got what the Native Americans were saying too, like, we want to be independent and do our thing, and you are taking that from us.
Right.
So he walked a fine line.
Well, and not only did he have to walk a fine line, but he knew that at any given time, he could be taken from
Yes.
that job,
Yeah.
that appointment, and put somewhere else, which is what happened
Exactly.
when the War of 1812
Yes.
happens. He's needed. he is, for all intents and purposes, an Indian fighter.
Yeah.
And he is known as that, as a general that is going to be going against the Indians.
And he was given a command, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. And so he resigns his governorship and goes on to be a general. And so they have to leave. The children, Anna, they all go back to Ohio. And that's where they will remain during the time that he's fighting.
Yeah.
And so, there's several battles that he is known for. And again, we'll talk about him with the Tecumseh story, where he's going to come back into play. But when the war ends in 1814, he comes back. Now, were you in Ohio for a while? Did you ever?
I did not live in there, but I've traveled and I've been to markers of his, of William Henry Harrison markers.
Yeah.
It's interesting there.
Well, I know that he was there for a while in Cincinnati, is
Yes.
where his home was, where he served in Congress, in the state Senate. I believe he was a state.
Yeah, it's interesting that he looped back there.
Right.
And now that would be central, similar to Vincennes being where it's geographically located, of course, Cincinnati being near water and other commerce pieces. But yeah, it's interesting that he ended up back there and didn't go back to Indiana.
No, he stayed in Ohio, and then eventually he was part of the Whig Party.
Yes.
And the Whig Party wanted a candidate, so they chose him in 1836. Didn't turn out so well.
No, it didn't. And it's interesting too, just as the title of the show, historically speaking, that historically that idea of an American rising in importance with their career or with other things they're doing, and then being recognized and maybe earmarked for a presidential position, you're seeing that happen back in the 1800s, and that happens now. If you have a young person in office that Senate, House, governor, that is doing some great things, then you start to say, should you run for president? And we're in the, in 2018, that could happen.
That could happen.
And what's interesting, because it was happening back then too.
Well, and a lot of people remembered him as being in the war, but also as a plantation, coming
Yes.
from that plantation stock. So when that happened, he wasn't really the candidate for that time.
Exactly.
And so 4 years later, they decide, well, maybe we ought to come at a different angle. He had the log cabin campaign, where you could go get so much land. And
Yeah, it had I don't know if we're allowed to talk about this type of show, but there's a liquor connotation too with
Yes.
the bottles and the jugs, and I don't think he was, and he probably, it seemed like, got wrapped up in the machine of that party.
Right.
And was just sort of naive.
Yeah.
And even though he was getting older, and then he wasn't as sure, so he let people, I say, make some decisions for him. And that log cabin campaign was kind of funny how that was.
Well, and they brought that Indian fighter back in
Yes.
with old Tippecanoe.
Yes, they
and
did.
So old Tippecanoe kind of worked because the West loved their war heroes, and
Oh,
they
yeah.
loved the Indian fighter.
Because it was still actively an issue.
Sure.
Whereas on the East Coast, you were revered if you survived the savages, and
Yeah.
it was a different setup out in the West.
Well, he needed somebody to help him in the South. So John Tyler was who he chose. So it's kind of interesting. He used the log cabin campaign. They had a huge ball, get the ball rolling.
Yeah.
And people would come into town and would have this ball, and they would stand on each side and roll the ball into town.
Yeah.
And they actually gave people balls, and they gave them little whiskey.
Exactly, the little log cabin shaped.
Yeah.
Or bottles that were, representing the log cabin.
Yeah, so they gave those away, and then, they would bring a stump, and he would get and talk and, chew the fat with the settler, the people around. So he was a good old boy. They liked having him around
And
to
that
talk
Tippecanoe
to.
and Tyler too. It's interesting that it speaks to how recognized he was, because that slogan, that Tippecanoe and Tyler too, that wasn't his name.
No.
They were using his reference of his experiences.
Right, and that was the first campaign slogan that was used, Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Yeah.
And he was they put him up against, of course, Van Buren was running again, and they was, like he was a washed-up man, and old Kinderhook.
Oh, yeah.
They had their connotations for him. It's kind of interesting. That's where "okay" comes from. I always
Really?
thought that was neat.
I didn't know that. I love it.
Old Kinderhook, the
Okay.
term "okay." So see, that was something we didn't know.
I love it.
So he gets president, and so Anna's back in Ohio. He hurries and gets to Washington. It's March.
Yeah, later than what would end up being how it is, but it's still, weather's not pleasant.
And
he's not listening to the advice of his people,
right,
of his
and
team.
He wanted to ride his horse.
Yeah.
They wanted to put him in a carriage, and
Yeah.
the war, the war general that he was, he wanted to come riding into Washington on his horse without his hat.
Yes.
So here he comes, and so if you want to kind of go into what happens.
Yeah, he's going to do his speech, and he's also warned about the weather. And it's interesting, too, and it's sad, but it doesn't surprise us. Weather is shifty.
Right.
So it's March. You'd think, typically our presidents have been inaugurated, well, our whole lifetime in, January at a prescribed date and time. But he refuses the hat. He refuses layers. And he's also, just to point out, he's getting up there in age as a winner. At that time, he was the oldest president elected
in 68?
Late 60s, yes. And physically he wasn't a young man anymore, but he also had that proud, I am the general guy, and I've withstood the Indians, and I've withstood moving, and I've withstood attacks on my house. So he not only refuses to wear layers and his hat, but he also decides to give a very long speech. So he's putting his immune system in a bad way by taxing his body, and it doesn't work out well, and he gets sick, and he gets the pneumonia, and he's in a bad state from pretty much early on, and then he's not president very long. Actually, our shortest.
Yeah,
our shortest president, shortest term,
right.
Not height. But yes, 41 days.
Something like that. Yeah. He's in there the shortest amount of time. He's the first president to die in office.
Yes.
So that's another first. So his wife hasn't even got to, and we got to think about this. It's not like you can just hop on an airplane,
Exactly
Air
right.
Force One and jet to Washington. She did not think that there was any hurry.
Yeah, Air Force One was a carriage.
Yeah, she didn't know that there was nothing. So she finds out about, somebody has to come back to Ohio and tell her. Her daughter-in-law is there. So the daughter-in-law is actually who is with him when he passes. So Anna doesn't know. And then what was it we talked about? She was the first to do something else.
Congress decided after his death that they were going to give her a pension, and they gave her a one-time payment of $25,000, which, I would take that now.
Sure.
And she got that in the mid-1800s, which was a sizable quantity of money. And it's also important to know that this type of thing had not really happened in American history. So even though he didn't stay in office very long, he did bring up ideas of succession, of having the president die in office, which was not typically what happened. And he, even though he had this legacy, it was different than some of our previous presidents because they lived out, their elder, days, like Thomas Jefferson, etc. So it was a pretty interesting time in America. And right before a 20-year period that was going to just reshape and change the country.
And here's his vice president who really didn't want to be on the ticket and
Exactly.
thought, 4 years and I'm going to do the Slim Shaky and get out of here.
Yeah, exactly.
And now he becomes known as your accidency because
they did call him that. You're right, the accidency. No,
he did not want to be.
And not only, you take someone who, like after President Nixon's second term, when he resigns, Gerald Ford steps in with only a couple of years left on the term, whereas Harrison's VP steps in and he's got the whole thing pretty much to do, which is pretty scary.
It's sad for him,
especially when you weren't planning it.
Well, we talked about how he was the oldest. That was until Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
Then Reagan, and now
President
President
Trump,
Trump.
yeah.
So age does not justify
Exactly right.
being a good president or a bad president. Or
And again,
whatever.
we're talking 140 years later when President Reagan assumes the office. So that's pretty amazing again, there's a nice continuity to
Sure.
American history in that regard.
And they have another connection that we're going to kind of bring into another show.
I like it.
That comes back
Yeah.
to William Henry Harrison.
Teaser to
Yeah,
our viewers.
teaser. You have to stay tuned. Well, so on, in a sad note, he does pass away. The next show, we're going to go
Yeah.
to his home, and we're going to
love it.
look at
Yeah.
Grouseland, and we're going to see some of his things and.
And talk to some people there.
Yeah, talk to the curator there who knows a lot about William Henry Harrison and his wife. And I want to thank you
Oh,
so
it's my
much
pleasure.
for coming. It's just
Wonderful.
so fun to just
Yes,
sit and
agreed.
hit the history back
Yes.
and forth. Well, on the next show, we're going to talk about one of William Henry Harrison's greatest nemesis, rival, I don't know how to put it, but the Shawnee Chief Tecumseh. Probably, in my opinion, which is not very much of a count, but I
Oh,
thought he
don't
was
sell
one of the
yourself. Yes.
greatest generals
Yeah.
in that. In
Him
that
and Geronimo,
time.
as
Sure.
far as in the Native American world of
Yeah.
their power.
Have a lot of respect for Tecumseh.
Yes.
He was. So we'll talk about him and the prophet, and we'll look at Matt Anthony Wayne and their showdown. We're going to talk about a prophecy and a curse and all kinds of things.
They're going to have to stay
fill in.
tuned. A lot of good stuff's
A
coming.
lot of good stuff's coming. So I'd like to thank Mr. Lucas Calhoun for
My
coming
pleasure.
in.
Thank you.
And lending us his sage on stage history knowledge. And I would like to just thank you for tuning in for our very first
Yay.
show of Historically Speaking. I'm Lori Roberts. I'm your host. Go out and learn some history. Thanks for joining us.